Earthquakes, floods, windstorms, fires, terrorist attacks. Disasters can strike at any time. When they do, 911 emergency responders such as fire, police, medical, and utility personnel may be overwhelmed with calls. They may not be able to respond for hours or days. How will you and your family survive a serious event like a disaster? What if the key to your survival isn't just what you know, but what your neighbors know? And how well you might be able to work together. Hi, I'm Grant Goody, and today we're going to talk about neighborhood disaster preparedness. Many years ago, we seemed to be able to get to know our neighbors so much better than we do now. But with today's busy lifestyle, you're lucky to get to know your next-door neighbor's first name, let alone anything else about them. Today, you're going to intentionally meet your neighbors and get to know them. And you'll also discover how their particular skill sets may help you and your family in a time of disaster. Together, you will learn how to work as a team to help each other when no one else will be able to. In this meeting, you'll learn the 9 steps to take immediately following a disaster. You'll identify the skills and equipment each neighbor has that will be useful in a disaster response. You'll create a map of your neighborhood showing the locations of gas and propane meters. And you'll complete a contact list that will identify each neighbor who may need extra help following a disaster, such as the elderly, neighbors with disabilities, or children home alone. So grab a pen or pencil and a Map Your Neighborhood booklet, and let's begin.
Welcome, everyone. I appreciate your willingness to gather with us to talk about neighborhood disaster preparedness. We're going to be talking this evening about some skills and about some procedures that will help us to be very effective as a group when disaster strikes. My name is Lou Ann Johnson. I am the Public Education Program Manager with Washington State Emergency Management. For the past 20 years or so, I've been helping neighborhoods like yours increase their readiness for disaster, and have learned through personal experience not only how important it is that you are ready to help and support one another, but almost as important that you can be very effective disaster responders. In the next 90 minutes, we're going to be talking about how exactly you can do that. Let's begin by getting better acquainted with one another. If we could go around the room and introduce yourselves, tell me who you are and where you live. I don't really care so much about your house number. That's not as informative as telling us what's distinctive about your house so that we can connect you to your homes. If you don't know what's distinctive about your house, ask your neighbors. You may learn some very interesting things about how your home is perceived. Wayne, let's begin with you, please.
Hi, I'm Wayne.
Now it's your turn. Pause the DVD and go around the room, introducing yourselves and describing what's distinctive about each of your homes. You have 10 minutes for this discussion. Pause now.
Very good. Thank you, and thank you all for being here again. I want to share with you a story that will demonstrate the importance of what we're talking about this evening. In 1991, the Oakland Hills, which are on the east side of San Francisco, experienced an horrific firestorm that resulted in the loss of 2,800 homes, killed 25 people, and left thousands of folks homeless. That event was chronicled in our newspapers in the Bay Area for many years. And a few years after, there was a story that really caught my attention. Peter Scott was a young man who had lost his mother in the fire. She was 85 years old at the time, and as he was recounting what occurred, he made this very poignant statement. He said, "If our neighborhood had talked with one another before the way we talk after the fire, this never would have happened." And then he said, "My mother died because no one knew she was there. If people had known she was there, she never would have died." This program provides a wonderful opportunity to talk, to visit, to get reacquainted with one another. We know as we look at disasters that people do better in the response when they know one another. In the emergency management community, that's one of the reasons that we drill and exercise all the time. We need to understand how our plans are going to work, but the true value comes when at 2 o'clock in the morning, as we are engaged in responding to a disaster, if I know you and you know me, and we have an understanding of the skill sets that we jointly possess, we feel a lot more confident and much more competent in our abilities as disaster responders. So one of the great benefits that will come from this program is you will get to know one another better in the process. We're going to be talking tonight about your neighborhood and the impacts that disaster can have upon it. So I think it's important that we start with making sure that we all understand what disaster is. Let me ask you the question, what is a disaster? How do we define it? And in particular, what is it that separates disaster from emergency? We call our emergency responders 911 emergency responders. There's typically 4 of them when we think about that. Who are those 4? Fire and police and
utility.
Utility folks. And who's the last one?
Medical.
Our medical folks. EMS, exactly right. So we've got police, fire, medical, and utility people. Here's a scenario. You return home this afternoon, about 2 o'clock, let's say, and something occurs either to someone you love or to your property such that it overwhelms your personal capacity to take care of it. What are we all trained to do when something like that happens at home? We pick up the telephone, we call 911, and in 3 to 5 minutes we'll have police or fire or medical or utility folks there to help us out. Is that a disaster or an emergency? Emergency, which is why we call them our emergency responders. Same scenario occurs when you return home at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Only in this instance, the causal factor is a significant earthquake. But it results in something happening to somebody that you love or to your property beyond your capability. What's your normal response? What do? We call 911. Only in this instance, what happens? It's busy, it's jammed, we get no signal. The bottom line result is no one is able to come. Disaster or emergency? Disaster. And that's what we're talking about. I would like you to keep that in mind as the context for our conversation today. Things happen in disaster beyond our personal ability to take care of them. Bad things, people can be hurt, stuff can go wrong at our property, we need extra help, but in a disaster, 911 has been overwhelmed. So the critical question becomes, who at that point responds to the disaster? Who become the responders?
Friends and neighbors. We do.
We do, exactly right, we do. And that's why we've gathered here today, to help us to be prepared for those very events when normal 911 emergency responders have been overwhelmed. I would like you to think, as we have that context of disaster, about your specific neighborhood. Wayne, would you remind us, please, the bounds of the neighborhood that you have invited to the meeting, and visualize that in your mind, because when we talk about a disaster response, that's the area that we're talking about. Who did we invite today, Wayne?
The people that
Pause the DVD, and your facilitator will distribute the Map Your Neighborhood handouts and discuss your neighborhood's boundaries. You have 2 minutes for this discussion. Pause now.
So we now understand the bounds of the neighborhood that we're responding to. And again, if you could keep that in mind as we have our discussion, as well as the fact that 911 emergency responders won't be available. You know, when we talk about an effective response to disaster, the time frame that we're the most interested in is the very first hour. We call that first hour the golden 60 minutes because of its value in helping us to save lives, reduce severity of injury, and decrease property damage. So as we think about a disaster occurring, I want you to keep in mind the bounds of the neighborhoods that we've talked about, and I also want you to keep in mind that the first hour, those golden 60 minutes, are critical in our disaster response. We're going to be talking today about the MIND program, which stands for Map Your Neighborhood. Whenever a disaster happens, what do you suppose happens to rational thought? Goes right out the window. It's a true thing. You know, we've done an awful lot of research and have identified that people don't panic. That's one of those disaster myths that we like to dispel. We're not so concerned about a panic response from you as we are concerned that you won't be able to think your best. When disaster occurs, it's very helpful to have an actual guideline that will help us to know exactly what to do to save lives, reduce significant injury, and save our property. So those are the things that we're going to learn first. If you can open your handout, we're going to be learning this sequence that will help us when we're not able to think our best. When the Nisqually earthquake occurred on February 28, 2001, we had at that time many neighborhoods that were organized and prepared for disaster. And one of my excellent block coordinators lived on the Capitol Hill area in Seattle in a two-story colonial-style home. On the south side of their home, they had two-story brick chimneys. Now, we remember whenever there's a significant event like an earthquake, the ground begins to move and shift underneath our feet. There are two rather dramatic ground motions we need to expect. One is the ground actually begins to undulate. Many people report feeling seasick during the movement of an earthquake. The other thing that happens is the ground begins to rapidly spring forward. The best way to conceptualize that rapid ground movement comes from looking at lessons learned in the Northridge earthquake in 1994 in Southern California. As damage assessors were going around neighborhoods, they found some evidence of stereos, televisions, and computers that had left their countertop as the ground began to accelerate, left their countertop, flew across the room, and struck the opposite wall at same height. Now you think about the force that would be required to hit your house that will send your television set across the room, striking the opposite wall, and it gives you a really good idea of ground acceleration. So when an earthquake occurs, we have ground undulation, we have rapid ground acceleration. And here are Dave and Sue on Capitol Hill in a two-story colonial home with two-story brick chimneys. What do you suppose happened in the ground movement to those brick chimneys? They come down. In fact, collapsing chimneys are one of the most prevalent forms of structural damage that we see following a significant earthquake. Now, as those two chimneys collapsed, they pulled the greater part of the south wall right off their home. They were both recently retired. Dave was upstairs in the den, Sue was downstairs in the kitchen. They fortunately had trained themselves to do the safe and correct thing when an earthquake occurs. Because when that kind of activity is occurring, where does rational thought go? It goes out the window. We know that we don't panic, but we don't think our best. When rational thought has fled, what's left behind? Training. Our training, the things that we have trained ourselves to do, and instinct. What do you suppose instinct tells you to do in a big earthquake? Tells you to run. We call that instinct what? Fight, flight. Exactly right, which says we're going to get away from the thing that is going wrong. It's the very last thing you want to do in an earthquake because things like south sides of the wall can fall down on top of us. As we've trained ourselves to do the correct thing, then even in the face of a very strong instinctual drive to run, we will do the correct thing. They had trained themselves. Dave upstairs in the den, what do you suppose he did? Got down under the desk, drop, cover, hold, we understand that. Sue in the kitchen didn't have a table to get under, so she knelt down beside the cabinetry, which gave her protection from things that might be falling out. They rode out that earthquake, lasted about 2 minutes, came together in the kitchen, and I will never forget the emotion which they shared with me as they looked at one another, so grateful to see that they were okay. Imagine the noise of the failure. Imagine the sight. Imagine the smell. And you can see why they were so relieved. They looked at one another and they said, oh my gosh, what do we do now? And then they said, almost in unison, the 9 steps. And they went and they grabbed the 9 steps and they knew exactly what to do. Now our time frame for an effective disaster response is what? It's the first hour, those golden 60 minutes. And this sequence is designed to help you, first at home and then in the neighborhood, know exactly what to do to make sure that yourself, your loved ones, your property, and then the neighborhood is in fact okay. Let's learn those 9 steps now.
The first step immediately following a disaster is take care of your loved ones. Your initial response activities will be in your own home. While personal preparedness is essential, neighborhood preparedness is the focus of this video. For personal preparedness resources, please see the information provided with the DVD.
Now we have learned that the more you are prepared at home, the less you are going to be impacted. I do not know of a stronger statement I can make for the value of personal preparedness than that. If you put yourself in the shoes of Dave and Sue, when that earthquake occurs, the time to prepare ends. And now we are going to respond and then recover. The more that we're ready before, the less we're going to have to worry about things going wrong, turning upside down, people being hurt, significantly injured. So we're going to start right there.
Step number 2 is protect your head, feet, and hands. Just like a firefighter would never show up at a fire without protective clothing, you should always protect yourself against injury by dressing for safety.
If you become injured because you haven't taken a second to get yourself appropriately clothed, now we've got more victims instead of great responders. So we want you to dress appropriately.
Protect your feet against injury by wearing sturdy shoes.
Boots are fine, but you don't need to run out and get a pair of boots if you don't have one. We're talking about a pair of sturdy shoes that will give you protection against what, primarily, do you think? Glass, exactly right. In fact, broken glass is one of the most common things that we see happen inside our homes. In fact, when we look at past earthquakes, the most common injury that we see typically is cut feet. Exactly right. How do we prevent cut feet? Shoes. Sturdy shoes. Where do we recommend you keep a pair of sturdy shoes all the time? Under the bed. Everybody have a pair of sturdy shoes beside the bed as we speak?
Yes.
For those of you who don't, take care of that today. Soon as you get home, make sure that there is a pair of sturdy shoes beside each bed. It is silly for you and your family to be at risk for the most common injury when it could not be more easily prevented. Now, when you think about the shoes that you want beside the bed, think about stepping on glass. So that's your measuring stick. What are the kinds of shoes you want or your children want to have on their feet should you encounter broken glass at 2 o'clock in the morning?
Protect your hands against cuts from broken glass and other debris by wearing leather gloves.
Where do you suppose we're going to recommend you keep the leather gloves?
Under the bed.
Under the bed. Exactly right, because then you know exactly where they are.
Protect your head from falling debris with a hard hat or bicycle helmet.
If it's a bike helmet you use routinely, we would rather that you have a hard hat because then day or night you know exactly where these are. Now, hard hats are available at the hardware store. They come now in a variety of designer colors. You can get them to match whatever it is you would like them to match, but we want you to keep them under the bed. When you first purchase them, don't think of this as a hard hat, because that, who wants to go buy a hard hat? Think of this as a gift basket. For mom, for dad, for grandma, for grandpa, for the kids, think of it as a gift basket. Mother's Day, put some chocolate, put some flowers, put a bow on it, give your mom a kiss, tell her when the chocolate is gone, I want you to put this where?
Under the bed.
Under the bed. Why? Because I love you, and I want you to be safe during a disaster response. Dad, put a ratchet set in there. Kids, put some Legos in there. But let's get hard hats under the bed. And whenever the gift basket is done being a basket, it goes under the bed. So day or night, we know exactly where it is.
Step number 3 is check the natural gas or propane at your home. This is one of the best ways to prevent residential fire, a common problem after disasters like earthquakes. Remember, 911 emergency responders, especially firefighters, will not immediately be available to everyone who will need them.
You know, of all of our 911 emergency responders, police, fire, medical, utility folks, you can write in stone the fire department is not going to be available to you. It's not because they don't want to. They want to help everyone. What prevents them from doing that? Clogged roads, and who needs them? Everyone. So there just is not enough of those folks to go around, which is why what we're doing today is so very important. And the fire department's first job on their response checklist is to conduct a damage assessment. Before they can even start fighting the fires, they need first of all to see who really needs them. Their mandate is greatest good for greatest number. They can't accomplish that until they have conducted a damage assessment. So the first thing they're going to do is what? They're going to drive the streets conducting a windshield survey to see where the greatest need exists. I talked to firefighters after the Northridge earthquake, and one of them said with a catch in his voice, hardest thing I ever had to do in my life is drive by fire, because we're the heroes. We don't do that. But in a disaster, they do. They'll make a note of your home, but they'll keep right on going if they're in the middle of their damage assessment. So when it comes to something like fire, we have got to be ready and prepared to be very aggressive. And one of the best things that we can do is simply remove the common fuel source. So step number 3 says shut off natural gas and propane as necessary.
There are only 3 reasons why you should shut off the gas. First, if you smell it, a smell like rotten eggs or sulfur. Second, you hear it hissing as it escapes broken pipes. Or third, the dials on the panel are spinning much more rapidly than normal.
If you come outside following an earthquake and you see abnormal movement on those dials, there could be a leak that is occurring that you wouldn't be able to smell or hear. In order for you to know that the dials are moving more rapidly than normal, what do you need to know? You got to know normal. So sometime in the next couple of days, go and get acquainted with your gas meter. You're going to need to know where it is and then take a look at those dials, especially at some time when the furnace is running, when the stove is on, when you've got quite a consumption of gas. Go and take a look at the dials. Then in an event, if you see abnormal movement, you will want to shut that gas off.
To shut off natural gas, turn the valve 1/4 turn or 90 degrees in either direction so that the valve crosses the pipe. Keep a crescent wrench next to the meter for quick and easy action.
Now it's important to remember that this is a valve and not a screw, so we do not care about direction. Either way will work. We simply want to take the valve, the principle being that we have now crossed the pipe with it that stops the flow of gas right here before it can flow through the meter and into the house.
To shut off propane gas, find the valve located under the safety cap. Turn the shutoff valve to the right until it closes completely.
Propane is like a faucet, and so in order to shut the propane off, that in that instance is righty-tighty to get it shut off.
Step number 4 is shut off water at the house main. If water pipes have broken, gravity may drain water out of your water heater and toilet tanks. Cracked pipes also may allow contaminants into the water supply.
Remember, when an earthquake occurs, we've got this ground movement. We've got undulation, we've got rapid ground acceleration, we've got a solid water pipe in the ground, and in the face of that kind of ground movement, what can happen? It can break or it can crack. By shutting the water off at the house, what we're achieving is making sure that the water that is in the house doesn't go anywhere. We're particularly interested in the water in the hot water heater. For most of us, that's 40 or 50 gallons of water that reside in the house all the time. If we were to have a big earthquake, we're talking potentially about an extended recovery period. You're going to want to have available that water as a resource to you. Additionally, maybe the break in the line occurs 1.5 miles down the road. What could happen at that 1.5 mile spot? contaminants, pollutants can enter the water supply, and those could come into your home and contaminate that pure source of water. So we shut the water off, again, where? At the house, to keep the water and to make sure that it does not become contaminated.
To shut off the water, find the master shutoff valve. Possible locations include the garage, basement, or near the water heater. Turn the valve to the right until the water is completely shut off. It's a good idea to label this valve and make sure everyone in the house knows where it is located. Please note that this is not the valve located in a cement box near the street. That valve requires a special tool and is very difficult to shut off.
Make sure that everybody in your house knows where the master shutoff valve is and get that labeled. I was raised with 6 brothers and sisters, and we're all relatively close together, and one evening at back to school night, my folks were both at the school, and our hot water heater sprang a leak, and we didn't know how to shut the water off at that time. Now, we wound up using all of the towels that we could find first, and then all the blankets, and then all the pillows, and finally the sofa cushions as we tried to stem the flood. Mom and Dad came home, they saw this fortress built around the hot water heater, and the water still flowing and going everywhere. My dad immediately took us kids and showed us where the water shutoff valve was. Now, unfortunately, that was about 3 hours too late for that particular event. So make sure in your house that everybody knows where that is. Get it labeled and make sure that you can get that to turn.
Step number 5 is post OK help cards. Following a disaster, you may need help, or you will want to help your neighbors who are in distress. Look at the OK help card on the back cover of your handout. Keep 2 Band-Aids with the card and use them to hang the card on the front door or a window so it is visible from the street. This will help everyone in the neighborhood locate those who need help immediately.
In our neighborhood, we have 20 homes. When we have a significant disaster, we want to make sure that you are prepared to take full advantage of those golden 60 minutes. If you had to check on every one of the 20 homes, you going to get that done in an hour? Probably not. That's the power of these cards, signaling your status to your neighbors. We know statistically, historically, most of us are going to be just fine. As we place the OK sign up in the window or on the door so that it's visible, we will be able, during the disaster response from the street, to say, they're okay, they're okay, they're okay. Oh, we've got potentially a trouble here, and we're going to be able to focus on people who are in need first. Now, we recommend that you use, what is your adhesive? Who's discovered that? A couple of Band-Aids, exactly right. So as soon as you get home, what we want you to do is put a couple of Band-Aids inside this workbook and place this, where do you suppose? Under the bed, along with sturdy shoes, leather gloves, hard hat. Now we've got everything that we need in order to be very effective in the first moments of a disaster response. When you look at the back, it helps you to remember the sequence or the priority that we want you to follow. And you'll see that it says, first of all, we are going to check on all the homes that have either help or no card displayed. What do you suppose would be a reason why people would not have a card up? They're not home. That could be the case. Or they have been injured in the earthquake. You know, as we look at disasters that occur around our country, there are 4 basic injuries that we typically see people experience. Those 4 are broken bones, sprains, cuts, and burns. Even in earthquake country, it's very unusual for us to see actual structural collapse. So we're not so concerned about crush injuries, really horrific things occurring. Instead, broken bones, sprains, cuts, and burns. In and of themselves, probably not life-threatening. But what could any one of these 4 injuries lead to? Shock. Exactly right. Shock. What's the problem with shock? You can die. You can die from shock. That's exactly right. I could have a sprained ankle, go into shock, and now my life is at risk. Now in the earthquake, remember we've got this dramatic ground movement, so you think that it's not uncommon at all for people to experience a sprained ankle if they were up on their feet and got knocked off. It's the possibility that I could go into shock that makes these cards absolutely invaluable. We talked about the criticality of the golden hour. We've talked about the threat of fire, and we've already identified that one thing that we can do to help reduce threat of fire is to shut off our natural gas. The second most important thing that we need to be prepared for is to outreach immediately to our neighbors, especially those who are in distress. Shock could cause someone in a disaster to lose their life. So we want to be very aggressive in going out and checking.
Step number 6 is put your fire extinguisher on the sidewalk or street edge. Fire can be a major problem during times of disaster because the fire department may not be immediately available. If one home catches fire, other homes in the neighborhood may be at risk. So be aggressive about putting out fires while they are small. Placing fire extinguishers outside on the sidewalk or street edge following a disaster makes this resource available to the neighborhood.
2 things to remember when you're placing your fire extinguisher outside. Number 1, we want these, when they're placed outside, to be in line of sight. If you have sidewalks, we want them to go right on the sidewalk. If you don't have a sidewalk, we want them to go right on the street edge. Here's a possible scenario. 2 o'clock in the morning, we have a significant earthquake that impacts this neighborhood. You step outside, and you know, most people are drawn to go outside. We like to help one another when disaster occurs. It brings out the very best in folks. You come outside, and you either hear a neighbor yell, "Fire! We've got fire!" or you smell, smoke, and see something's gone wrong. At 2 o'clock in the morning, you're going to want to be able to look up and down the sidewalk, the street edge, and see a whole street full of these extinguishers. So when you place them, keep in mind the idea of line of sight so that they are immediately accessible. Don't leave them on the porch. People are not going to go looking for them. We need to be able to see them immediately. Second thing to please keep in mind is we're only doing this after the disaster occurs. In other words, I don't want you to go home today and put your fire extinguisher outside on the sidewalk. When I was working in Seattle, I had a great block coordinator. She was about 83 years old, and she called me a few days after we'd held the meeting, and she said on the phone, "Luann, you'll be pleased to know about 80% of our neighbors have their fire extinguishers outside on the sidewalk." I said, "Mary Jane, I wish I had your persuasive abilities. That's fabulous. Now go tell them to put them back inside before it gets dark, or we're going to lose them. They'll be gone in the morning." So remember, this is part of the disaster response sequence, keeping in mind that of all the 911 emergency responders, who's not available? It's the fire department, because they have that responsibility to do a windshield survey. So folks, fire is going to be our job. We're eliminating the common fuel source by shutting off gas that's problematic, and we're making our extinguishers available to the neighborhood so that we can quickly address that particular threat.
Step number 7 is go to the neighborhood gathering site.
Now you'll notice when you look at this that steps 1 through 6 have been completed at our own homes with our loved ones. Step 7 is where we now begin to focus on what we're going to do as a neighborhood to help and support one another. The first thing that we need to do, step number 7, is come to a neighborhood gathering site. The reason for that is when the disaster occurs, if all of us were to start all of a sudden going out on the street responding, what would we really have going on in the neighborhood? Chaos. We'd have people running around. We wouldn't know who they were. We wouldn't know where they were. We wouldn't know for sure what they were doing. So even though it takes time, some of our precious 60 minutes, it in fact saves time on step number 7 to come to a common place where we will get ourselves organized and coordinated. Turn over to the next page where at the bottom it says Neighborhood Gathering Site and Care Center. And we're now in the neighborhood going to identify 2 places. We're going to first of all identify the neighborhood gathering site, and then we're going to identify a neighborhood care center. For the neighborhood gathering site, there are two things that are good to keep in mind as we choose this location. And we want to make sure that when we're organizing for disaster, we don't have the discomfort of the weather compounding what we're doing. So try to think of a covered location inside the bounds of our neighborhood. Somebody's carport, a large porch, an open garage. We want it to be covered. Second of all, we want it to be easily seen. Now, there are some of our neighbors who are not able to join us today, and that's fine. We will acquaint them with the things that we have covered here later. There also may be, during the time that we have this meeting and when the disaster occurs, some of us may move, other people will move in, and they might not be aware of this neighborhood gathering site. If it is easily visible at the time of the disaster, people will be able to identify with it and will also come and join there. For one thing, we will all be showing up dressed in what? Our hard hats, our leather gloves, and our shoes will have wrenches. We will look like we know what we're doing, and when people come out of the neighborhood, even if they don't know anything about our disaster response plan, they're going to see us. It will be a magnet to draw them over to us, and then we've got additional people that will be helping us out. So we want this place to be easily seen so that it will be a visual cue or reminder that this is where our gathering site is. So given those two parameters, easily seen, covered, where should our neighborhood gathering site be? What do you think?
Well, we have a wraparound porch.
Pause the DVD and determine where your neighborhood gathering site should be. Write the location in two places in the handout. First, in the top box on the Neighborhood Gathering Site and Care Center page, and in the box for Step 7, immediately following disaster. You have 5 minutes for this discussion. Pause now.
For neighbors who are not with us this evening, let's make sure that we let them know where our neighborhood gathering site is going to be. While we're on this page, let's also choose now the Neighborhood Care Center. This is a home inside our neighborhood where we will bring people who may have been impacted by the disaster. The folks that we're most concerned about are people that are elderly, anybody who may have disability, and children who might be home alone at the time of the event. You know, I was in the Bay Area for the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. That's an event that occurred on October 17th at 5:04. And of all of the activities that occurred in the neighborhood, outreach to the children proved to be the most important. We had lots of parents who had not yet returned home from work, and some of them did not get home for over 36 hours. Now you can imagine the emotion that they were experiencing, and as I debriefed with them, they said they were about going out of their minds, except they knew that the neighborhood was prepared to outreach and take care of their children. I happened to be in the grocery store when that earthquake occurred, and I'm telling you that's not a very happy place to be in the middle of a 7.1 shake. Absolutely scared me to death. As I got outside, it's interesting what happens to our thinking. I should have gone back to work because I worked for emergency management. Instead, I was driven to go home and get my camera. I wanted to come back and take pictures of what I'd experienced in the grocery store. As it turned out, that was very fortuitous because as I was driving home, I was able to see these neighborhoods acting, helping, responding to this event. And as I drove around, I saw in a couple of instances the knock go on the door open up, and kids that were in hysterics. Mom and dad are not home. You imagine again the noise, the movement, everything that's going on. Power was out in our community almost instantaneously. It was getting dark, and bless their hearts, they were scared to death. But to see then the warm embrace and those children taken to the neighborhood care center made all of the effort that was required in order to put this program in place so incredibly worthwhile. Those parents were so grateful, and the children were so grateful. Now let me remind you that as we do these neighborhood activities, we want the kids to be involved as well. And when you know that there are children who might be home alone, we want to make sure that we outreach to them today while times are quiet so that they know you and you know them. Children in school are taught now the idea, the concept of stranger danger. And the very last thing you would want to do following an earthquake is be an unknown who knocks on the door of that child to have the child open it. And now not only do they have the trauma of the earthquake, but there is a stranger to them standing on the door. So we want to make sure that children are integrated into our preparedness activities as well. It's nice as we're picking this place, if we choose a home that has fewer steps rather than more steps, would be the requirement that we would want to keep in mind. Where in our neighborhood should we establish our neighborhood care center?
Pause the DVD and determine where your neighborhood care center should be. Write this location in the box on the handout. You have 5 minutes for this discussion. Pause now. Before moving on to steps 8 and 9, fill out the neighborhood skills and equipment inventory.
As you turn to the neighborhood skill and equipment inventory, you're going to see on the left that we've got a list of skills and knowledge that are helpful in a disaster response, and then some equipment and supplies that also will help us have an expedited response in those golden 60 minutes. What we want to do here is actually write down the names of our neighbors that have these specific skill sets and these pieces of equipment. As we go around, raise your hand and let's everybody write down the names. Why do I want everybody to write the names down instead of just have one person have a copy for the neighborhood? Exactly right. Murphy's Law says if there's one list, that list is going to be where when the disaster occurs. Exactly. So we want everybody to have this list. And remember, this list is going to reside where?
Under the bed.
Under the bed. Very good. So who here's got first aid skills? Let me see raise of hands. If you could give us your first and last name, and everybody, let's write that down.
Pause the DVD and write down the names of neighbors who have skills or knowledge in these areas. Then do the same with the equipment and supplies list. You have 15 minutes to complete this task. Pause now.
Now that we've completed the neighborhood skill and equipment inventory, we're going to make the neighborhood map and contact list. If you turn in your handout, on the grid is where we're going to sketch the map of our neighborhood, and here's where we'll make the contact list. Now if you come back one sheet, we've got some pretty good instruction about how we're going to create the neighborhood map and what it's going to look like. I did some work in advance of the meeting and sketched out the neighborhood. That should look familiar to us all. This is where we live. What I want you to do is sketch this now on the grid part of your handout. Remember, this doesn't have to look pretty, but it needs to be relatively accurate. The second step, you can see that we've numbered the building lots consecutively. This is so that we have a way to match each home with the information on the contact list. The third step is to identify the exact locations of our natural gas meters and propane tanks. The reason that we want to do that is so that in the event of an earthquake and we step outside and smell natural gas, we don't have to wonder, wait a minute, who's got it and where is it? We know exactly in our neighborhood who has the gas and where it's located. So now we're going to plot on our maps the exact location of the tanks and the meters. Who lives in building lot number 1? Mr. Lee, do you have natural gas or propane?
Natural gas.
Natural gas. Where is your meter located?
Pause the DVD and sketch the neighborhood map on the map grid page in the handout. You have 15 minutes to complete this task. Pause now.
Now that we've completed our neighborhood map, step number 4 says we're going to complete our contact list. So if you turn in your handout to the contact list, what we're going to do now is match the contact information in each of our houses with our contact map. So coming back, who lives in house number 1? Excellent. Let's get your contact information here. If you will tell us your name, any children's names. The final thing that we need to do now is capture those in our neighborhood that we're not going to want to forget when the disaster occurs. These are our neighbors with specific needs. It includes people that are elderly, any that may have disability, and children who might be home alone at certain times of the event. So think about all of us that are here and those of us who may not be here that we will not want to forget. This is the Francis Scott in our neighborhood. This is the children who might be home alone at the time of the earthquake. Who do we know that we want to capture on our contact list in the grayscale boxes?
Pause the DVD and match the home you have labeled number 1 on the map with number 1 on the contact list. Who lives in house number 1? Write their names on the contact list. Do the same for the entire neighborhood. Finally, in the gray boxes, write the names of those who may need extra help during disasters. This includes neighbors who are elderly, neighbors with disability, and children who may be home alone. You have 15 minutes to complete these tasks. Pause now.
Let me have you turn in our handout, and we're going to do a quick review of what we've accomplished so far. Let's say that we have suddenly an earthquake.
Earthquake!
Step number 1 says what? We're going to start at home.
You okay?
I think so.
Step number 2 says what? What's on our feet? Boots are sturdy shoes. What's on our hands? What's on our heads? Hard hats, and all of that is kept under the bed. Step number 3 says what? Because we're concerned about possibility of fire and explosion, we've got 3 indicators that the gas needs to be shut off. What was 1? Smell 2. Sound 3. The dial spinning more rapidly than normal. Step 4 says? So we're talking shutting it off where? At the house, not the cement box, but at the house. And the reason for that is what? Keep the water in the house and to keep what out? Possible contaminants. Step number 5 says what? On the front door or window, what's the adhesive that we're going to use? Band-Aids. Step number 6 says, because we want it to be, what's our visible line of sight? Very good. Step 7 says, when we've completed those 6 activities at home, where are we going? And that in our neighborhood is located at? Excellent. Very good.
Step number 8 is form teams at the neighborhood gathering site.
This is our neighborhood gathering site where we have come to get ourselves organized and coordinated now before we begin fanning back out into the neighborhood to see what's happened, how we can help, and what we can do. Remember, our scenario for our event is an earthquake has occurred at 6:30 this morning. Now steps 1 through 6 we did at our own home. Step 7, what did we do? We came right here, so here we are. It's now time for us to make sure that every person in the neighborhood is safe and okay. We've got 4 teams that need to be established. We need to have somebody, a group of folks who will listen to the radio. What's our primary emergency alert station? Cyber 710. Good. So we've got a radio right here. We need to have a group of you listen for information that gives us broader information about what's happened in this disaster, but we're especially listening for information specific to our community. Who can do that for us today?
We can do that.
Oh, excellent. Here's the radio.
Perhaps Cardinals franchise history.
We need to have team number 2 formed that's going to go and check on the people that we're worried about. That's going to include folks that are elderly, we identified Marge, people with disability, and kids who might be home alone. What's the tool that we're going to use in order to accomplish that? The contact list. So, team, who's going to do that for us? Great. Open up to your contact list and let me send you out right now to check quickly on the people that we've highlighted there.
Hi, Marge. Are you okay?
A little bit shaky.
Would you like to come over to the care center? Would that be helpful?
That would be nice.
Good.
Yes.
Our 3rd team is going to go out and check the status of our natural gas and propane, see if we have any leaks that need to be addressed. Who's going to do that for us? Excellent. I've got some wrenches for you, and when you've completed checking on all the homes, and by the way, how are we going to remember which homes we need to check? On the map. So open up to the map. And as soon as you've completed checking on all the homes in our neighborhood, then return back here. And finally, we need a team that's going to go and check for all the help cards and homes that have no cards displayed. Who's going to do that for us? Excellent. And when you've completed, then make sure that you return back here as well. And you've got your first aid kit in case you should encounter anybody with problems.
Need help here?
Yeah, my mom needs help. Come on in.
Step number 9 is return to the neighborhood gathering site. After your team has completed its work, go back and share with your neighbors what you have done. If additional help is required, plans can be devised to respond to those needs. In about a year, you will meet again to take the next step. You'll want to update your map and contact information to include those who have moved into your neighborhood or those who weren't able to meet with you today. Then you will go through a realistic disaster scenario to see how these steps will help you when disasters strike. This practice will help you develop confidence and competence in responding to disasters when they occur. Remember, when you get home, find your master water shutoff valve and label it. Get a pair of sturdy shoes, hard hat, and leather gloves for everyone in your family and put them under their beds. And don't forget to staple a couple of Band-Aids to your handout and put that under your bed as well. As you can see, Map Your Neighborhood Disaster Preparedness is simple, fun, and it may even help you get to know your neighbors just a little bit better, which may actually help save your life or the life of someone you know. Just by participating, you have made real progress in preparing your neighborhood for a disaster. Thanks for coming. We'll see you next time.